Welcome everyone. I'm gonna give it a minute, give everyone a chance to come on in before we get started. So let me just share my screen and we'll get set up. Let's see who is joining us today. A lot of very familiar names. Welcome back everyone. For those of you that are new to the Teen Science Cafes, I'm Lauren Traster. I'm the 4-H Teen and Leadership Program Coordinator, and we are so glad to have you with us today. To get started, I know a lot of you know what we do, but for those of you, again, who are new, we love to have you introduce yourselves in the chat, who you are and where you are from. It just makes it so nice to just see who's with us. So Leo's back from Greensboro and KL's back from Maryland. Fuzzy's with us again from Virgins, and Amelia's here again from Greensboro. Who else is joining us today? I see there's a few more names than who has introduced. Hi, Anna from Essex. So keep introducing yourselves. Gabby's with us again from Mass. Gabby is younger than our typical audience, but we have allowed her to join us, and she always has some really good questions. So nice to have you back. I'm gonna pop into the chat box. If you need our live streaming today, just click on that link and you'll be able to follow along with captioning. So if you haven't introduced yourself yet, please continue to do so. But I'm gonna go over our protocols, why we are here in Zoom. So all of you are muted today. You don't have the ability to unmic yourselves and you're not on video. So the only way you can communicate with our presenter and myself and share your thoughts with each other are in the chat box and in the Q&A box. And we use them very differently. So the chat box, which you all have just introduced yourselves in, we use when the presenter will ask you questions and you'll respond to her, or maybe you just have a thought about something she's talking about that you just want to comment on, but we stay on topic. So try not to be distracting in the chat box. The Q&A box are questions you have for the presenter that you can pop into the Q&A box, and when there's a good break in her presentation, she'll go into the Q&A box and answer questions. It might be very close to when you ask your question, but it also could be, you know, towards the end of the presentation. It's hard to know. So just try to be specific with your question so she knows what you're really asking about. So just be courteous and respectful. Again, don't create any distractions. And the only way you can do that is with the chat box. I know all of you have been showing up and you're so good about participating and being engaged. So I know I don't actually really have to tell you that, but it's more fun when you're engaged and you participate. So before we get to today's presentation, I do just want to remind you or tell you, because I don't know if you know yet, registration is open for some of our summer programs, and we are going to do some in-person programs, which is awesome. So we have Summer of Science, and there's a series of really cool workshops. You can sign up for one of them or all of them. They're free. They're mostly in Chittenden County, but there's some are in other parts of the state. So you can see the workshop description, the dates, and the location if you go to the website that's at the bottom of this page. We are also doing our Natural Resources Management Academy. This is a program we have been doing for many, many years. Usually it is a 2-night overnight, but just because of all the restrictions, we're only doing a 1-day this year, but it's gonna be really good. We're gonna have 4 workshops that you rotate throughout. It's out at the Green Mountain Conservation Camp. And if you're interested in natural resources, you're gonna be able to meet professionals who that's their line of work, and they're gonna do some hands-on workshops with you. So check this stuff out and hopefully you'll think about signing up. All right, so moving on. Today's presentation is Sustaining Forests in an Uncertain Future. And our presenter is Jess Weickel. So let me tell you a little bit about Jess. She's a PhD student at UVM in the Silviculture and Applied Forest Ecology Lab. She earned her Master's of Forest Science from the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment back in 2018. And then prior to attending graduate school, she worked as a forester managing forest land for municipal water departments and private landowners. She also led youth conservation crews, worked in landscaping and gardening, ecological restoration, and land conservation outreach. Jess has a Bachelor of Science in Forestry from the University of New Hampshire, and also an associate's degree from Bard Early College at Simon's Rock. So let's all welcome Jess, and let's get ready to learn all about our uncertain future. Sounds ominous.
It's a little ominous. I am trying to keep it positive, so hopefully it will be. All right. Okay, can you see my screen? Excellent. So yeah, I'll be talking about forests and forest management and some of the things that are threatening forest health and how management works to keep forests growing. There we go. So I'm going to start out by talking about what I do and how I got to where I am today. And then I'm going to explain what forestry and forest management are. Some of the negative impacts on forests, a lot of them relating to climate change and invasive species, and then talk about how forestry works to solve problems. So I'm a forest ecologist, and what this means is an ecologist is someone who studies the relationships between plants, animals, and their environment. And this can take place at any scale, in lakes, in forests, at a tiny scale with bacteria, at a large scale across a whole region. And I focus on forests, so specifically forested ecosystems. These can be like the rural forests you might think about in Vermont. They could also be the forest in the park in your neighborhood if you happen to live somewhere more urban. But basically systems where trees are the dominant species that are growing there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about where I've lived in my life, and then I'll go into some detail about what I did in each of those places. So I grew up in Western Massachusetts in a really small town called Great Barrington. It was pretty rural, and I spent a lot of my childhood hanging out in the woods. And I lived there through my first 2 years of college. Then when I went to undergrad, I moved to University of New Hampshire, which is in Southeast New Hampshire. Was there for 3 years and then moved back to Massachusetts, where I worked for another 5 years before I decided to go back to school, this time in Connecticut. So there's already a theme here where I've pretty much stuck in New England for all of my life. I was in Connecticut working on my master's degree for 3 years and then moved up to Burlington, Vermont, which is where I currently am now and have been for 2 years. And I'll just point out one more spot on the map, and that's where I do my research. That's in far northern New Hampshire at a place called the Second College Grant. It's 27,000 acres of trees and no people. So when I talk about the forests I discussed today, I'll mostly be talking about the kinds of forests that grow in New England, although some of the concepts apply more broadly to other regions. And I really like to use this photo as a sign that I've always been destined to work in forests. I have the tree t-shirt, I'm out in the woods, I'm smiling, but in reality, things were a lot more winding and complicated. So I'll start with high school. I didn't finish high school. I left after 2 years. I was pretty frustrated with the way the teaching happened. I was, a teenager and convinced I had better ideas of how I could be spending my time. On top of that, my school was getting really into standardized testing. I just decided I was fed up and luckily had extremely supportive parents who helped me figure out what else to do with my life. So I was able to start college without a high school diploma. And I was interested in art, music, photography. So I started out going to college for those things, did that for 2 years and realized that while I loved them, studying them in school was awful. It kind of took all the fun out for me. So I started looking for things that might make more sense to study in school. And the big question of science came up. That's kind of the thing you do if you don't do art. But I had some reservations about studying science and this is why. Can anyone type in the chat and tell me what all of these photos have in common?
And Jess, there's always a slight lag delay as they're typing. But here we go. Kale says labs.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Anyone else typed it? Amelia says they're all lab scientists and not working in the field.
That's great. Yeah, so Amelia, you pretty much hit the nail on the head there. And Gabby too, scientists doing experiments, you're right. So I grew up spending all of this time outdoors, and I thought that this was what scientists do. They're in labs, they're doing experiments, they're always wearing white coats, they're always under fluorescent lights with not a lot of windows. And I thought there was no way I could be a scientist because I didn't want to do any of that stuff. So I decided to just take some time off of school and do other things. So I got a job doing landscaping work and started out doing gardening, planting flowers and trees, and then learned how to build stone walls and patios and operate heavy equipment and drive trucks. And it was really fun. But then I ultimately realized that I wanted to keep learning, and that there had to be some way I could figure out what I wanted to do. And at this point, I was introduced to forestry, which seemed like it could potentially solve all of my problems. So I'll pose another question to you all. Before I define it, I'm curious if any of you have any ideas about what forestry is. So if anyone wants to type in the chat, what is forestry? Great, studying forests, the study and maintenance of trees. Those are both really good answers, and they're both true. Excellent. So there's a kind of complicated definition here, and I'm going to walk through all the parts of it because the complexity of it is kind of why it's so interesting to me. So it's considered a science, practice, and art. So it's the science of studying forests and understanding how trees grow. Beyond that science piece, it's also a practice in that people take those scientific concepts and act on them on the ground to help trees grow. And it's also, in most cases, defined as an art, bringing me back to some of my early interests in art. And the way it's an art is that there aren't any simple answers. You can understand all of the science behind it, but it's hard to be a good forest manager unless you can bring some of yourself and some understanding of the human environment around it into forestry. And then this is another long chunk of words: establishing, managing, using, and conserving forests, trees, and resources. So establishing means starting them growing. Managing means carrying out various activities to make sure they keep growing. Using can mean using the space a forest is in, for example, hiking, and could also be using a product that comes out of the forest, like wood to build your house. And conserving means making sure that forests stay as forests. And then the last piece is in a sustainable manner. So in a way that the resource isn't depleted to meet desired goals, needs, and values. So these goals, needs, and values come from people who own the land, people who use the land, and society in general. So the whole definition is a science, practice, and art of establishing, managing, using, and conserving forests, trees, and associated resources in a sustainable manner to meet desired goals, needs, and values. To break it down more simply, beyond understanding science, it involves a lot of understanding of people because people interact with forests all the time. It involves understanding economics because land and forested land and products from forests all have a dollar value. And it's hard to manage or understand the management of forests without understanding the dollar value. It includes plant science. It includes understanding wildlife, as a massive number of wildlife and animal species live in forests. And it also understands concepts like engineering. in terms of designing how to access forests. In recent years, a lot of forestry practice can also be pretty computer heavy in terms of understanding where forests grow and building mapping, building maps and understanding them. The most important part to me about forestry is that it involves spending tons of time out in the woods. So that's really great. And that's what drove me to go back to college, realizing that I could spend a lot of my class time out in the woods. So I went to college for forestry, got a bachelor's degree, and then went and got a job. I did something called working as a practicing forester, which means that I was self-employed and anybody who owned forest land could call me, ask me questions, or tell me something they wanted out of it, and I would help them figure out how to do that. So that could be hiking trails. There were some people who wanted more birds in their forests to look at. There were also people who wanted to make money from cutting down some trees and selling it for timber. I did that for a few years and also really enjoyed it, but found that I was really interested in doing research about forestry. So the main difference there was during my career, I moved around from multiple different properties and was there for a short time each. Doing research meant that I could just look at one facet of a forest, dive really deep into it and understand what was going on. And so I did that for my master's degree. I stayed in southern New England in Connecticut, where I had been working in the forest and began just diving into really deeply understanding how oak trees grew. And from then on, I realized I wanted to do more research, that I really enjoyed it, and also that I was interested in teaching. So I decided to keep going to school, and I'm now a PhD student where I am wrapping up year 2 of probably about 4 to 5 years of school. And my goal when I finish is to teach people about forests and to help them learn that science doesn't have to be in a white coat in a lab, and that it can be out in the world you live in, and that there are other opportunities. And the second reason I want to teach is that I've attended 4 colleges now, and only had one female professor who was teaching about forests or natural science. And I think that it would be great if more young women could have professors who they related to. So I'm hoping that I can help be a change in the field in that way. So we'll shift gears now and move into some of the talk about forests. And first, I'm curious if and how any of you interact with forests. So I'd be happy to hear any of you or see any of you type into the chat box and let me know what you do in forests or with things that come from forests. Great, Lauren likes to hike, ski, and walk the dog. I do the same things. Gabby hikes and bikes on trails. Anna hikes as well. That's great, lots of hiking. It is one of my favorite things to do, walking. Oh, that's great. Jack made a teepee out of fallen sticks and bark from a fallen tree. That's a really fun thing to do in the woods as well. Some of the things I really like to do in the woods are also hiking. I also interact with forests in that they are basically what makes me make money at my job. Gabby likes to walk with friends. Excellent. Other things I do in forests are look at birds. I like to bird watch. And I also interact with forests by the products that come out of them. So I live in a house that is built out of wood. Great, Gabby likes to look in nature. That is one of my favorite things to do as well. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about why we as a society need forests. And I have a lot of answers here, but if anyone wants to fill one in, feel free. Gabby, thanks for saying you love nature. I also love nature, and I'm so happy I get to work in it all the time. So I've filled in just a couple of reasons why we need forests. And they include everything you all mentioned, hiking, camping, recreation. But I also added a few things that we don't think about as much. Water filtration, flood control, carbon storage. These are all things we don't see, but are really important. And then there are products that come out. So wood to build our houses, wood for musical instruments, furniture, fiber for newspapers, books, toilet paper, all things. I know I can't live without any of the three of those. And then there are more kind of unseen values. I put in joy and meditation and bird watching. So Gabby, along the lines that you said, people love nature and it's important to them. But because there are so many people living in the world and so many close to forests, these outputs, Lauren asks, why toothpaste? And the answer is not every toothpaste, but there are a few toothpaste brands that actually use cellulose from wood, which is like a compound the tree creates to hold the wood cells together. And it's actually extracted and used to help the texture of the toothpaste remain kind of sticky. Alice, you're right. Aspirin does have willow in it. I think I did put medicine somewhere in there. So yeah, aspirin is one example of that. And cinnamon, yeah, cinnamon also comes from trees. Excellent. There are other medicines that come from trees, and then there are also understory forest plants that medicines come from. Like ginseng is a big one. That's an herbal medicine that grows in the forest understory. So isn't a tree product, but wouldn't be in place without the forest there. And as I was putting together this list, I kept on thinking of more and more things and had to stop myself so I could keep going. But the main point being that we need a lot of things from forests, and we need to manage the forests in order to get them out. So does anyone have any ideas about what forest management is or how it's done? What do we do to manage forests? Taking care of them. Great, Gabby, thanks. How do we take care of them? Like, how might one do that, do you think? You don't have to answer if you don't want, but I'd be curious to hear if you do. Protecting them from deforestation, Amelia, thank you. Gabby, making sure they are not cut down too much. Alice May says, make sure we keep them free of litter. Excellent, these are all really great answers. So I have another kind of boring textbook definition here, which is the process of assuring forests remains healthy and vigorous. Excellent, Gabby, protecting the wildlife in them. Process of assuring a forest remains healthy and vigorous while meeting goals of landowners and or society more broadly. So you're right, this includes protecting them from deforestation and making sure they're not being cut down too much, protecting the wildlife in them. And what you all are talking about also include goals of landowners or society more broadly. For example, Gabby, a goal might be protecting wildlife for someone who owns a forest. Often forest management does involve cutting down trees, or it's called harvesting timber for people who are working in the forestry field. So I'll try to keep saying cutting down trees during the rest of this talk, but I might say harvesting timber, and that's what I mean. It does not need to involve cutting down trees. So it's a little bit of both. And even a forest that is untouched by humans can be considered managed because a decision has been made that to keep that forest healthy and vigorous, it needs to be not touched by humans. So it encompasses a lot of different things, and I'll kind of walk through and explain some of them now. So this is one example of what forest management can look like. In this case, trees are being cut. Some of them are being turned into wood chips that can become paper, and some of them are being turned into logs that will go to a sawmill that will turn them into boards that someone could use to build their house. this is another example of forest management. This is a very old hemlock forest, and the people who own this land decided not to cut down trees because the value they wanted to keep there was that there were really big old trees there. So those are kind of two extremes, but there is a lot in the middle here. Starting from the left and moving to the right, there's cutting trees to create a view from a hiking trail, leaving a tree standing that has a hole in the bottom for an animal to den in. At the bottom left, we have cutting some trees while leaving others behind as a seed source for future trees to grow. I think that bottom middle photo of a really large oak tree, if it hits the line of like joy and meditation, it's a beautiful tree. Moving into the right, in some regions of the US and the world, people use what's called prescribed fire to manage forests. And then in the bottom right, there's a forest that was damaged by a pest that killed some of the trees, and the management there was actually made to leave the trees standing so that they could decompose and return nutrients back to the soil. So these are just a handful of the many different things that fall under forest management. And I'm eventually going to get to how we manage forests today, but I think it's really important to kind of talk about the forests in the Eastern US and how they were managed in the past. So my next question to you all is, does anyone know how old the forests are in New England or want to hazard a guess? Oh, Gabby has a question.
I'm sorry, I was going to type the answer back, but she was asking what is a prescribed fire? And so if you wanted to let her know, I'll stop typing the answer.
Absolutely. So there are fires like the ones out in California that happen by accident and that are really, really big and out of control. And prescribed fire is fire that people intentionally set in the forest under only the right weather conditions with a lot of safety measures in place. So by doing so, those fires often clear out the forest understory without causing damage to the big trees in the forest. And there are forests not up north here, but further south and in the Western US. Yeah, fire can be good for forests. There are a lot of fires that or forests that evolved with natural fire. So some of the pine trees have pine cones that won't actually open and release their seeds unless the fire opens them. So the forest won't persist without fire. So it's just another management tool. And I have a few answers to this question about how old the forests are. Gabby says very old. Jack or Simon says millions of years old. Anna says 120 years, weren't many cut down for sheep farms. So Anna, you're the closest. I'm gonna walk through some of the history and then I'll ask the question again and see if anyone wants to change their answer. So to do this, we'll jump a little ways back in time, starting with before the 1600s or before this region was really colonized by people coming over from Europe. And there were people here, there were a number of Native American tribes living in the region, although they had a much smaller footprint on the land than people did later on. So another question about what you think. In the forests, when just the Native American people were living here, did trees die often or was the forest disturbed? And what might have been causing the disturbances or how did those trees die? If anyone has any guesses for either of those questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Great, Gabby says not as much. That is correct. And the answer I'll give is not as much, but probably more than you think. The Native Americans or indigenous people used fire. They didn't call it prescribed fire because that's a pretty modern term, but they used ground level fire to do things like clear their walking trails, to clear the forest understory for hunting, to promote food crops like raspberries or hazelnuts that grow in the forest understory, and to clear small patches of land for agriculture crops, because even though they tended to move around some, they also grew crops in place in some places. Other than the human use, hurricanes, tornadoes, and ice storms also killed trees in patches. There was an occasional like lightning started natural fire that would be bigger than those ground fires. And then beavers actually had a pretty big impact on forest layout across the landscape. They would often build a dam in a stream, flood an area, and then the flood would kill the trees. Eventually, the beavers would leave that site, their dam would break down, that area would get drained again. It would be really rich soil from the stream sediment, and eventually would return back to forest in the long term. So while the landscape was a lot more forested than it is today, it was what's called like a patchwork. Basically, there were a lot of areas of closed canopy mature forest. Closed canopy meaning all of the trees are touching each other in their canopies. There were open fields, and then there were wet meadows and shrubby fields in between. And then to Anna's point about the sheep farmers, as Europeans began to colonize the area, most of the land was cleared. Some of it for sheep farming, some of it because trees were needed to build houses or to be burned for firewood to keep people warm. Some of it was cleared to grow agricultural crops. And there were about 200 years of time span when most of the land was cleared until people in the US started moving west. Lauren mentioned wood for ships too, that's right. Oak trees up in New England were often used for building ships, and pine trees, because they grow so tall and straight, were used for the big masts in the middle of the ships. And then in the southern US, some of the pine trees were used to build ships because they had a lot of pitch in them, which helped keep the water out. As folks started moving west, they found out that the farmland there was a lot less rocky than it is here, and just walked away from their farms here and never looked back. So by the late 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of this region was turning back into forest. And that's kind of led us to where we are today, where the forests were young then and they're working their way towards being mature. So with that context, anyone could submit a revised answer to this question if they want. We got one from Gabby already. She says 300-year-old forests, maybe. So the answer here is 200 years, maybe. That's getting closer. Most of the forests in New England are actually between 100 and 150 years old. If you figure somebody walked away from land in, say, 1890 and it slowly returned back to forest, that's 130 years ago. And that's about average time. So we have now these, in the present day, like really dense, closed, beautiful forests that are healthy and green and support many of the values we talked about earlier, but they're the product of a really high level of disturbance. And given the fact that all of that land abandonment happened in a pretty short time frame, they're all around a similar age, which means that though they live for quite a long time, they're all going to get old and start slowing down in growth and dying at around the same time, which could potentially be an issue in the future. And I'm going to come back to this giant slide full of values just to say these highly disturbed forests are still meeting most of these values today. And the management we do today takes place to meet usually 2 or 3 or more of those goals in one space at one time, but across the whole region, most of them are met. So you couldn't expect one single forest like the one you see on this screen to give you all 20 of those things on that last slide, but you could expect to get 2 or 3 from this forest and 2 or 3 from the forest next to it. And then I just wanted to address cutting down trees. A few of you mentioned earlier on that part of being a forester is protecting forests from deforestation. And that's a really good point and a big part of what foresters do. But the other part of what foresters do and what forestry is figuring out how to cut down trees to make sure we have enough wood to build houses and to build furniture and to burn it for firewood if we need heat, while still making sure the forest left behind is functional. So it's part of what they learn in school. So in the Northeast US, most of the time when trees are cut, it's done in a way that the forests naturally regenerate, or new trees come up as seedlings and saplings after the old ones are cut down, just because of the seeds that are already there. So cutting trees down doesn't mean the forest is gone. It just means that there's a younger forest in its place. And so the end result when we manage forests is a forest of varying ages, which helps forests stay resilient to various threats to their health. So Gabby mentions if we don't help forests in the future, we might be in trouble and we need forests. And Gabby, you're absolutely right. I'm going to talk about some of the things that are putting forests in danger, and how we might be able to help keep them growing with management. But yeah, this is just cutting down trees is something we need to do, but it's something that absolutely can be done both wrong and right. And there's an opportunity to do it right. So I'm going to change gears here and talk about how forests grow to provide the values we need from them. And this is a tough science question, and it's okay if no one knows the answer. And if you do, that's great. What is a niche or niche? I pronounce it niche. But it has to do with how trees interact with each other in a forest. So if somebody wants to type an answer and go ahead, and if not, I'll jump ahead with the answer in a moment. Amelia, that's great. The role of an organism within its environment. You got it perfectly right. That is what I have too. The role an organism has in an ecosystem. So this example is in an aquatic ecosystem, but it shows how in this one area of a lake, there are 5 different birds. There's one set of resources, all of the fish and plants and bacteria and algae in that lake. It's one set, but each bird in this photo just uses one piece of those resources. So they can all exist in that ecosystem, but each one in a certain role and just using a certain amount of the resources. And the same applies to forests, where they use certain resources and they also contribute certain things to the ecosystems that are important. So this is an example of what's called a northern hardwood forest. These are what grow in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and a lot of New York State, and where I do my research in New Hampshire. And there are 4 main species that I'll talk about here and how they each occupy a different niche. So we'll start with sugar maple, which is probably one that you've all heard of, because in addition to what I mentioned here, it's also where we get maple syrup, which is really important here in Vermont. It grows in shade. Its seedlings, when they first start growing, can germinate through leaf litter. So on the forest floor, it doesn't need bare soil. And its leaves decompose quickly, which means that when they fall in the fall, the nutrients in the leaves go back into the soil and can be reused really quickly. A spruce tree grows in the shade. It also creates dense shade. It's evergreen, so it keeps its leaves year round instead of losing them like the other trees. And it produces cones. So the fact that it's evergreen means that it can photosynthesize in early spring and late fall when the other trees can't, which means it can use water that's available in the ecosystem. And it also can create really good habitat for deer because it keeps so much snow from getting on the ground in the winter. So it helps wildlife. And they all do, but in different ways. A beech tree is the only one of these that produces nuts, which is a really high protein food source for deer, turkeys, bears, squirrels. So it's got an important role in the ecosystem. When it reproduces, it often sprouts from the roots, so it doesn't need healthy seeds to grow. Unlike the sugar maple that uses a lot of nutrients and takes a lot of and returns a lot, it doesn't need a lot, but it also doesn't return a lot, and it also grows in dense shade, so it can grow under the other trees. And then the final one is a yellow birch tree. Its seedlings can grow on bare soil and dead wood. So if that's where the ground conditions are, that's the tree that will grow there. It has rough bark, which means that it can host a lot of different insects, which birds can eat. Unlike the other trees that all grow in the shade, this one grows really well in the sunlight, and it's much faster growing than the others. So when you combine all of these together, they're each using different resources in the system, and they're each returning different resources back to the system. If one of these trees were to be threatened by an invasive pest and potentially die, those roles that that resource use need would be empty. And the role that it plays out, like providing food for wildlife, wouldn't be being filled anymore. So you'd potentially need a new tree species or more to refill those traits there. So this is kind of key to how forests and ecosystems respond to change and how we can keep them functioning, is understanding what roles each of them play and how other species can fill those roles if something happens. And here's another question with a shift in gears is, what do folks know about climate change and how do you think that might affect forests? And Gabby, I see you have a question about how to identify a maple tree. And the easiest way to do that is by looking at the leaves. Maple trees have, I will show you a picture very quickly because I think I'm running behind schedule. Maple trees have these things that stick out, which are called lobes. And then these little dips in the middle, which are called sinuses. And the sinuses are U-shaped and not pointy if it's a sugar maple, is the easiest way. But I am gonna keep us going now. So regarding climate change, I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly because I am running low on time. As a result of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere due to fossil fuel use, the sun rays that come down to the earth aren't able to escape the atmosphere as easily, meaning that temperatures on the ground are warmer. So the temperature of the earth heats up in general, and then warmer air also is able to hold more moisture. So temperature regimes are changing a little bit. And Alice has a good answer to my second part of my question of how climate change might affect forests. And that is that some trees won't be able to travel north fast enough to escape global warming, and they might die out if nothing is done. Alice, that's a great point. One I'm going to talk about a little bit more, and definitely one that relates back to the different niches of the trees and how the forest system functions. And I'm actually going to just jump right ahead into some of the climate change impacts. So this one here is what Alice actually said. Again, we're looking at sugar maple, and the green map on the right is where sugar maples currently grow. It's a range map based on temperature. As it keeps getting hotter, that southern part of the range will start to shrink. It'll move up here, so the sugar maples won't be able to be part of that forest. Sugar maple has a bigger range than some other species, but as it gets hotter, it's definitely possible that the species won't be able to potentially migrate north fast enough to keep up with the changing temperatures, because Trees can't migrate the way birds can. They have to migrate by setting a seed to the north, letting that one grow up, set another seed to the north, and do it again. Amelia also has a great answer. More extreme weather might harm trees, so more thunderstorms might make trees fall. That's another really good answer and absolutely true, especially with things like hurricanes. The other big ones I'll point out here are drought. If we're not getting enough rain, like the spruce trees in these pictures, the trees won't have enough moisture and they'll die. And if they haven't been able to put down seeds, then this forested area will end up not being forested anymore. Gabby mentions blizzards and too much rain. That's right. Blizzards, while they're common and trees can handle them in the winter, if they come in the late spring or early fall when trees still have their leaves, the tree branches hold a lot of snow and they can break. And then Gabby also says too much rain and floods, which brings us to my next example here, which is excessive rainfall causing erosion. So in this case, the soil got so moist on this hillside that part of the hillside just fell away. So that's a big problem with too much rain, as is flooding. So flooding streams can wash out their riverbanks and forests. So these are all really great answers. Thank you. And then separate from climate change, there is another potential concern for forests, and those are invasive species. Can anyone tell me what invasive species is? Lauren says emerald ash borer. Perfect. That is actually what's on my next slide. So thank you. And then Amelia says non-native species that comes into a different environment and pretty much takes over and harms natives. And Gabby says a species that is not native to an area. Great, thank you, both of you. You're both right. And the second part of Amelia's answer, that it takes over and harms natives, is important. Because there are species that are not native to an area that can live there without harming the natives, and those aren't really an ecological concern the same way the ones that cause harm are. So Lauren mentioned emerald ash borer. This is an invasive insect that's not native to the United States, but got brought over accidentally in wooden shipping pallets and was released. And where it's from, it fed on ash trees, but they had co-evolved together. So those ash trees had some natural defenses that kept them from dying. The ash trees in the United States don't have those natural defenses. So the emerald ash borer lays its eggs under the bark of the ash tree. And when the larvae hatch, they eat the area right under the bark. This is called the cambium. It's basically the living part of the tree and the area where the tree transports all of its nutrients. So once that area is eaten, the tree can't get nutrients up to the top and will begin dying from the top down, as you can see in the picture on the right. And there's enough of this pest around now that the continued occurrence of ash as a common forest species is threatened. So it's a pretty big deal, especially when you think about the niche that ash trees fill in the forest and what goals they help reach. It could be a big loss for the ecosystem. And invasive plants are the second concern. This plant is called Japanese barberry. It was originally brought into the US as a landscaping plant, and it's quite pretty, as you can see in the photo on the left. But its berries are very palatable to birds who eat the seeds, who eat the berries, fly out into the woods and poop them out, and the barberry starts growing there. And you can see in this picture on the right, Kayal says they've pulled barberry before, so you know that it's quite thorny and unpleasant. And it also has the ability to take over a whole forest understory. So this forest on the right with the person standing in it has no other plants growing in the understory. So it's just invasive species. It's an unpleasant forest to recreate in, and it's missing some components of ecosystem health. Kay also has a nice part is you don't have to bag it. So what that means is that some plants, even if you pull them out of the ground, if you put them back down again, they'll reroot. Barberry, if you pull it out of the ground, it'll dry out and usually won't keep growing. As Kale mentions, the sunlight kills the roots. Gabby's mentioning kudzu, which is a plant that grows further south. It's also quite bad. Luckily, we don't have it in New England, but it's a vine that really likes sunny areas, especially alongside the highway, and grows very fast. So these are all examples of plants that really threaten the ability of a forest to keep doing all those things we want it to do. And forest management is often done in a way to protect forests against all of these threats while providing all of those values that I keep mentioning earlier on. So it often involves complicated decisions, activities, and trade-offs to figure out what processes will keep the important ecosystem intact with all the different trees growing in their niche, can protect them from things like invasive insects and plants, and often can also provide the wildlife habitat needed and the wood products that we as a society need to survive. So it's not an easy process at all. And I'm just going to walk us through a few examples of what that looks like on the ground now. So forests can be managed for increased species diversity. And the more different tree species are growing, the more different niches can be occupied. So both providing services to that forest in the form of like wildlife habitat and also using the resources most efficiently in the forest. Forest management can also include growing trees for a really long time before cutting them. So rather than growing them on a short rotation, like an agriculture crop, letting them grow and get really big and old, and then eventually cutting them to be used for products we need means that the carbon they're storing can be stored long-term. Forests can be thinned so that the trees that haven't been cut out have more resources to grow. So if any of you have ever had a vegetable garden and thinned your carrots so that the other ones you leave behind get bigger, you can do the same process with a forest. So that if there's a drought, there are fewer trees competing for water, for example. Forest managers can try to create some of that patchy landscape that was common when the indigenous people were on the land. And they can do that by cutting some trees in open canopy gaps, but leaving uncut mature forest right next to that. So there are two different forest types next to each other, meaning that if, say, a big storm comes, like you all mentioned earlier, maybe the older trees will get damaged and die, but the younger trees next to them will be able to keep growing and the forest will persist. Forests have a bunch of different diverse components. So in this case, on the left, we're looking at a really old tree with shaggy bark that tree's been left behind. And that smaller inset picture is actually a cute little bat roosting under that shaggy bark. So forest management can include retaining trees like that. The middle picture is actually mossy downed log that hosts a bunch of different decomposers and was also a great spot for these birch seedlings to begin growing. And then forests with big old rotting logs or standing trees tend to host a lot of fungi and mushrooms. So these are basically diversity at different scales than just in the forest canopy. And then wildlife habitat is really important, as I've mentioned a few times before. So looking at these pictures or thinking about forests in general, does anyone have any thoughts on what kinds of animals might use these parts of the forest? Great, Gabby says squirrels. That's absolutely true. Leo says birds, also true. Amelia says woodpeckers retrieve bugs from the trees. That's exactly what's happening in the photo on the left. And Leo, the photo on the right is really good habitat for songbirds. They like forests with varying heights of trees. and varying tree species, because it means more insects for them to eat and more cover for them. Gabby also says deer, chipmunks, birds, and bugs. All of those are absolutely correct. And then the one other thing I'll bring out is that center tree is hollow in the middle. And that means that animals that need dens or burrows can live in there. So a hollow tree could host a bear or smaller animals like porcupines, raccoons, foxes. Bunnies do live in the woods too. There are some bunnies that really like brushy areas, but there are some bunnies that live in the woods too. So great answers all around. And then I'm just going to tie everything back to what I do now. So I research different ways that we can make forest management help forests handle stress like climate change and invasive species. So I'm lucky enough to spend all of my summers out in the woods, measuring trees, looking at trees, thinking about trees, measuring regenerating seedlings, and just generally enjoying the outdoors. And I'm looking for answers to some of these questions and trying to understand what makes a forest healthy. Then the second part of my job that I really love is sharing what I learn with other forest managers. So I get to talk to people who are working in forests every day and compare my research information with what they're doing on the ground, and we both learn from each other. So I'm gonna wrap up there and take questions, but I believe Lauren has one more poll she wants you to do.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. That was great. So before, as you guys are thinking about your final questions for Jess, I'm gonna throw up a poll that I would like everyone to take. So we always have you rate the cafe on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. And then what you learned, 1 meaning you didn't learn much, and 5 being you learned a lot. And then when you're done, go into the Q&A and put whatever questions you might have for Jess. I'm going to keep the poll open until we get a few more responses. And then hopefully you all might have some questions for Jess before we sign off today. All right, I'm going to keep the poll open one more. Again, get your questions in. I think it's amazing. I love Jess's story about how she came to become a PhD candidate and how important it is for women to be represented in science, not just in the labs, but in front in the classroom to inspire other people to go into these fields. So her path is really unique. You know, you don't meet a lot of people getting their PhD who dropped out of high school. And so I think it's really cool that she shared her story with you. We do have one question that said, I've learned about ocean acidification because of climate change. Does a similar process occur in soil?
That is a really excellent question. And the answer is yes, but it's complicated. So a lot of the acidification type issues with soil have a little bit more to do with pollution than with the changing temperatures. So acid rain is less of a problem now than it used to be, but it's related to pollutants like those that come from factories and cars and often go alongside with fossil fuels and CO2, changing the chemistry of the rain and basically falling and stripping nutrients from the soil because the rain's more acidic. In terms of CO2 actually directly impacting the chemistry of the soil the way it does to the ocean, that's not quite happening in the same way, simply because nutrients tend to make their way into the soil through rain or through plant roots or fungi. So there's an extra step needed in the process there.
Great question, thank you. And I do want to mention again, one of the summer programs we have, the Natural Resource Management Academy. There's going to be 4 workshops, and one is going to be led by a county, actually, I don't know if he's a county forester, but a practicing forester. So if Jess's work and Cafe inspired you to learn even more about forestry, again, sign up for Natural Resource Management Academy. It's free. And one of the workshops will be with a practicing forester where you can get, you know, hands-on and learn a little bit more about how foresters do their work in the field. So little plug there. So Jess, I don't see any more questions. Nope, one just came in. Amelia asks, what can be done to protect forests from emerald ash borers? Is it more of a matter of preventing the emerald ash borers from coming in the first place, or is it helping the trees after they have already arrived? Great question, Amelia.
That is a great question, thank you. So again, it's of course complicated. At this point, the emerald ash borer is here and it's moving. They can fly only about a mile, but if a larva ends up in a piece of firewood that's in the back of your car when you're going camping, they can travel as far as a human can drive in a couple days. So there's not a lot we can do, unfortunately, to physically slow the spread. There is some research into other insects that could actually slow it down. So there's something called a parasitoid, which actually can lay its eggs inside the emerald ash borer larva and kill it before it hatches. So there's been some research into releasing these beneficial pests on the landscape and hoping that they can expand their populations and follow the emerald ash borer and slow them down. And there's been limited success so far. Gabby says, could woodpeckers help? Unfortunately, not enough. Basically, the damage that the woodpecker does to the tree eating the larva also damages the tree. So the other way that it can be managed is with pesticide being applied to the tree. But that it has to happen every year, and it's quite costly. So when it comes to forests, it really isn't a feasible thing to do. It is possible if you have like a beautiful ash tree in your yard, people definitely pay to do that to keep their ash tree long term. There's one right outside my window I'm looking at right now that I hope the person who owns it does that too, but I'm not optimistic. But at a forest level, it's pretty tough. The other thing forest managers are thinking about is genetic variability, to see if there are some forests that might have some genetic resistance. So a lot of times forest management for emerald ash borer involves specifically making sure to retain female trees so that when they get pollinated, more genetic crossing can happen, in the hopes that some resistant varieties will come up on their own. So that's a pretty interesting way to kind of work with nature to get some resistance. Oh, and Fuzzy, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay, I'm responding. So Fuzzy, you can always just change your name on the participant. Because I know that you go by Fuzzy, but Jess just met you, so she didn't know. She only would know your name as Alice. So you can always just change your name to how you want to be called. Just find yourself on the participant list and choose rename yourself for the future. So with that, I don't see any more questions. Let's all thank Jess for sharing her work with us, her passion, her pathway. So interesting. And thank you all for joining us today. Remember, next week is our last virtual Teen Science Cafe for a while, because in the summer, we're going to be getting together in person. So hopefully I'll see you next week, and everyone get outside and enjoy this beautiful day. Hopefully you have a forest near you that you can go walk into right now and just reflect on what Jess told you about. So everyone have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.